Hey everyone, we are going to be speaking about the Dome of the Rock. That's that big dome in the middle of Jerusalem. But to understand why in the world it is, well, it was built and what it has to do with Abd al-Malik and early Islam, we have to remember what's going on at the end of the Civil War in the 690s, right? Abd al-Malik, the slightly differentiated successor from Muawiyah, the initiator of the Umayyad dynasty, defeats Ibn al-Zubayr, right? And there's a lot of different tensions and shocks and traumas in the early Muslim or believer community. The grandson of the Prophet Muhammad has been killed. Mecca and Medina have been destroyed. The Kaaba has been destroyed. There's a lot of death and destruction. And to recover from it, Abd al-Malik is going to recreate his legitimacy by renewing the religion, renewing the army, and renewing the empire in different ways. And we're going to look at another aspect of how he creates a new religious message, one that's different from the believer movement that came before it. So we've spoken to some of the visual experiments he's done, that is particular coinage, if you remember. Coinage such as the aniconic coins of Abd al-Malik that end up coming to the fore, which basically ultimately get rid of any particular clear Sasanian or Byzantine predecessor and imagine a new version of Islamic visual culture centered around text with no images, but is heavy on the message, anti-Trinitarian message, and the idea of the double shahada, the fact that there is no God but God, but also that Muhammad has a central part in this new religion, much more so than any other prophet-like figure. But now I want to talk about monumental buildings, and specifically this Dome of the Rock, what's called the Kubat al-Sakhra, which is really the first monumental Islamic building, especially at least the only one we have remaining today. There was, of course, a masjid or a mosque built in Medina, but that original one doesn't seem to survive. So this one basically survives from the year it was built in 1692, when it was built not literally by Abd al-Malik, but at his orders and under his command. And so we have to think about, well, what kind of message does it send? And first of all, what in the world is it? Because if you look inside of it, it is basically a weird octagonal structure with a dome over it. And underneath that dome, well, inside the dome is a whole variety of very nice mosaics in gold and elsewhere. And at the bottom of it, besides the mosaics in vegetal motifs, etc., and you have inscriptions in Arabic all around. And this is, again, one of the first times that the Quran has been used as a text for inscriptions in this period. But we also have the Dome of the Rock, the actual rock under the dome, which is at the center of this whole thing, which is here. Okay? There is, in the middle of it, a giant dome, a giant rock. So what is the purpose of this? What is going on here? What was supposed to have happened in this rock? And why is there a dome over it? And why was it commemorated? Because it's not a mosque, right? There is a mosque. If you look at the Temple Mount, there is a mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque over here. But this is separate. And why is it built on the Temple Mount? Right behind the original temple of the Jews, very close to other things such as the Holy Sepulchre, Calvary, other major religious sites. What is going on? What's the purpose of this rock? Later Muslim tradition says that this is the rock from which Muhammad ascends on his night journey. Basically, he rides a sort of magical horse with a human head called Burak. And he goes all the way to the Haram, to the Kaaba. Then he flies up into the sky, and then goes up to the different heavens, and then descends, etc. But this is actually a later tradition. So we have to understand, well, what did they think that this rock was for? And I think one of the clearest signs is that this is also a moment, a place to commemorate where they thought clearly that the end of the world was the Judgment Day was going to happen. So Let's think architecturally though first, right? What is the precedent for a structure, a weird octagonal structure with a sort of dome in the center? Well, it's actually based off of what's called a martyrium, which is a sort of popular octagonal church that became popular in the 5th centuries in the late Roman Empire. This is San Stefano Rotondo in Rome, which has a very similar layout, as you can see here, the pulpit, etc. Not the pulpit, but the altar is under the dome, right in the center like this, and you would have probably people streaming all around on the edges. And this idea was then carried over into Palestine, which of course was part of the late Roman and Byzantine world. And in fact, there were a number of octagonal churches throughout this space, such as this one in Caesarea, which no longer exists, but this is what they imagined in reconstruction. So you actually have an octagonal church on a temple platform like this, very similar to what ultimately is the Temple Mount, right? So you actually have a similar moment, similar model that is probably a source of inspiration. If we look even closer to Jerusalem, there is the Kathisma Church, which is another octagonal church. Again, has a rock in the middle of it. This was a church that we talked about before because it was a church that was actually used by Muslims as a place of worship while remaining a church, right? So it was actually built in 456, renovated in 531, when it takes the form that it mostly does today. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a ruin that was rediscovered in 1992. But for 2 centuries, it was basically used as both a Muslim and Christian place of worship. And in fact, they built a mihrab, a prayer niche, into the south wall. And so we actually have, people would have been familiar with this type of format and structure. And this is obviously what they built in the Dome of the Rock. Right, here's the remains of the Kathisma Church today off of a highway in Israel. There's some mosaics on the floor that are still around, but the nicest mosaics, some of them that have been, these are pavements today, are in museums, where we can see actually very similar motifs on the mosaics to what will ultimately be used in the Dome of the Rock itself, which is palm motifs, vegetal motifs, etc. In fact, we have a similar decorative program here. Of course, in the church, you don't have Arabic inscriptions, but here they'll be added Arabic inscriptions. Now, you might ask, well, how in the world are they making these mosaics? Well, they're basically bringing in, these are mosaics were a high point of Byzantine late Roman art, and there were very skilled craftsmen, Christian craftsmen, working in this area, but also coming from the Byzantine world to work and build this new structure. You can see some of the examples of this amazing type of mosaics that they were building at that time in Istanbul today. If you go to the remnants of the Byzantine palace, you can see the floors, which are amazing. And so it's not a surprise that you have similar types of mosaics adapted and built for the Dome of the Rock. Of course, again, the idea here is that there's a new visual language that is centered not on humans or animals or any of these motifs, but essentially an iconic in which vegetable, like scrolling vegetable motifs become almost geometrical, and eventually they will become geometrical in a sense. There is the use of inscriptions, Umayyad inscriptions in Arabic, again as a decorative motif, but also again to convey a message. And in this case, they're quoting pieces of the Quran, which is the very first time that the Quran has been used in this fashion. And if we look at the major themes of the inscriptions, partially from the Quran and partially kind of summarizing aspects of the Quran, we have one, the most important part is what is called the kind of double shahada idea. The fact that there is no God but God, right? So this, from the very beginning, the believer movement was the basic idea that it is a monotheism. He has no partner. But then there's also the second part, is that Muhammad is God's servant and his apostle, right? So Muhammad now has a central place, and this is kind of the main message, that to be a believing Muslim, you have to believe both of those, right? Muhammad is number one, and there is no God but God. The second theme here is, again, the importance of the day of judgment and resurrection, right? This is repeated again and again, and this was a core believer belief in the early believer/Muslim community. So there's quotes. It says, he will gather them all to himself on the day of judgment. Muhammad is the apostle of God. May God bless him and accept his intercession on the day of resurrection on behalf of his community. So again, they're still explaining, hoping that there is some moment, expectation that the end of the world is coming, and that they need to build a place to welcome and to stage this end of this coming. The third part in this, I think, is clear also on the coins. We have a very clear anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christian message. Not so much that Christians are evil, but that clearly their theological beliefs are wrong. Right at this point, people know what Christianity is, people know what Islam is, and there's a moment in which the two are being defined as separate religious traditions. It is no longer as possible to say you're a Christian and a believer as it was before, and now they're saying, well, there actually are specific beliefs that are contrary to Christian doctrine and spirit. So we see is in this point, O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion and speak of God only the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only the apostle of God, and his word, which he cast unto Mary, and the Spirit from him. So believe in God and his apostles, and do not say three. Desist. It's better for you. God is one deity only. He's above having a son. It is not for God to take a son. Glory be to him. So what do we have here? It's a very clear idea. Okay, Jesus is not the Son of God. He's just an apostle. He's a messenger, just like Muhammad. But Muhammad is the last one and the most important. There is no Trinity. Everything and the idea of a Trinity is a sort of front to monotheism, etc. This is the basic idea. So, thinking of all this evidence, why in the world was the Dome of the Rock built? How do we actually understand it? What is the purpose of this weird non-mosque, non-church structure that is over a rock in the middle of Jerusalem? Well, one idea is that there's basically Abd al-Malik built this to compete with Ibn al-Zubayr. Remember, Ibn al-Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba after its destruction by Yazid. He reinserts Muhammad as a central figure. He has a lot of credibility for these events. And now what he's trying to do is essentially create a new competing religious monument on the level of the Kaaba. Theory number two, that this is supposed to be some sort of victory monument by taking essentially clearly Christian structures that would have been used as churches and all of a sudden turn them into Islamic monuments. It is saying, well, we're here now and we're different from Christianity, and this is our clearest expression of that. And this is what we see again by altering the imagery of the mosaics and changing the imagery in the coins, changing the church, the function of this structure away from a church to something else. There's ideas that this is the purpose of this Dome of the Rock. And as we saw here, there are various ways of manipulating coins and messages on coins to get that across. Theory number three, and probably what is perhaps the most interesting and convincing, is that this is supposed to be a paradise-like staging ground for the Day of Judgment. So the use of all those plants in the mosaics, the high-quality materials, the gold, the idea here is to create an image of paradise as clearly as possible with the architectural and decorative motifs of the time, while also emphasizing the fact that the Day of Judgment was going to occur there in Jerusalem, as had been predicted and stated to the believer community by the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, and that it was a reminder for the community that it's a moment now to be pious and pure after this civil war, and that it's still very possible that the end of the world is coming, and that the message of Muhammad and the centrality of Muhammad is still very much true and central to this day. And in some ways we can take and compare different parts of these different theories, but I think probably theory number three is the most convincing of these, while of course it has a clear message that differentiates Islam from Christianity at that time.